In this talk we want to think about the pituitary gland. Now, given that this gland is only about the size of a pea, it's about 1 to 1.5 centimetres in diameter, and given that it only weighs about half of a gram, there's an awful lot of anatomy and physiological detail to consider. The pituitary gland itself sits in the pituitary fossa, which is a small bony depression in the base of the skull. And the gland is attached to the base of the brain by a stalk underneath the hypothalamus. So it's kind of dangling there on a stalk beneath the hypothalamus. And like most things associated with the pituitary gland, the stalk has a complicated name. Anatomically, it's correctly referred to as the infundibulum. So the infundibulum is the stalk connecting the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus at the base of the brain. The pituitary gland itself is composed of two adjacent but completely separate lobes that are completely different types of tissue, but they're next door to each other. Now, the frontal lobe is composed of glandular tissue, and the anterior glandular tissue produces hormones and releases these hormones directly into the blood, and these are often referred to as the trophic hormones because they stimulate other endocrine glands. Now, the posterior lobe is made of neurological tissue, and hormones released from this lobe, that is from the posterior lobe, are actually produced in cell bodies located in the hypothalamus. And once they've been synthesized, these hormones are packaged into granules, which then travel down secretory axons before being released from the posterior lobe. So the posterior lobe hormones are actually produced in the hypothalamus, but stored and released via the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And because posterior lobe hormones are produced in nerve cells, this process is technically referred to as neurosecretion. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is a neurosecretory facility. Now, again, to complicate the issue, scientifically, the correct name for the pituitary gland is the hypophysis. And because the anterior lobe is made up of glandular tissue, it's referred to as the adenohypophysis. So the adenohypophysis is the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. It's glandular tissue. And the posterior lobe is made up of nervous tissue. So this is correctly termed the neurohypophysis. So the neurohypophysis, nervous tissue, that's the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, I think we'll deal with the function of the posterior lobe first, that is the neurohypophysis, because it's relatively straightforward. It only produces two hormones, oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. Now, for a long time, it's been known that oxytocin has got two primary functions, or two functions that have been historically well recognised, because release of oxytocin is stimulated by distension of the uterus in the later stages of pregnancy. And it's the oxytocin that stimulates the contraction of the myometrium, that is the uterine muscle, during delivery. And this explains why oxytocin can be used to induce labour, because it will cause contraction of the myometrial muscle. And another role of oxytocin that's been recognised for a long time is during lactation. So when a baby suckles at the nipple, this stimulates a reflex which leads to oxytocin release. And in this case, the oxytocin contracts the milk ducts, which stimulate the letdown of milk, so the milk can come out of the nipple and be drank and suckled by the infant, by the baby. So in these cases it makes sense because the oxytocin is working by stimulating smooth muscle contraction, firstly in the wall of the uterus and then the smooth muscle in the wall of the milk ducts. But more recently it's been discovered that oxytocin has got numerous other, you could say, more psychological functions. So oxytocin seems to be involved in forming the bonding and the loving relationship between the mother and her child. It's a bonding hormone. It seems to increase feelings of love. It probably adds to family cohesiveness. It increases the emotional feelings the mother has for the father and for the baby. And some workers have also postulated roles for oxytocin in other forms of attachment and indeed in sexual activity. So oxytocin has been well known for a long period of time to have these simple smooth muscle contracting functions, but it also now appears to have numerous more complicated neurobiological activity in addition. Now, the antidiuretic hormone is also released from the posterior pituitary gland, and a diuresis refers to the production of a large volume of urine. So you might have come across diuretic drugs such as furosemide, and these are given to increase urine volumes. So an antidiuretic is going to have the opposite effect. It will act against diuresis and it will reduce urine volumes. So this means that the more antidiuretic hormone in the blood, the lower the volumes of urine that will be produced. If there's no antidiuretic hormone present, then the kidneys will just carry on and produce very large volumes of urine. So what the antidiuretic hormone is actually doing, it is increasing the reuptake of water from the nephrons of the kidney. And if you increase the reuptake of water from the nephrons, there's going to be less water left in the lumen of the nephrons. Therefore, lower volumes of water are going to pass into the collecting ducts and on into the calyces of the kidney. Less urine will go into the renal pelvis, into the ureters and down into the bladder. Urine volumes will be lowered because there's more reabsorption of water from the renal tubules. And it's interesting to notice that alcohol inhibits the release of the antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary, meaning there's less antidiuretic effect, explaining why large volumes of urine are produced when people drink alcohol. So we see there is an intimate relationship between the hypothalamus and the base of the brain and the neurohypophysis, that is the posterior pituitary. The antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin are actually produced by neurons in the hypothalamus. They then pass down the axons of neurosecretory neurons, passing through the infundibulum, that is, through the pituitary stalk, and are released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, the neurosecretory axons, which actually secrete the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin, they actually secrete these hormones very close to the capillary vessels passing through the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and these capillaries form a plexus, a network of capillaries passing through the posterior lobe. And blood is supplied into this posterior lobe of the pituitary gland by the inferior hypophyseal artery, which is actually a branch of the internal carotid artery. The blood then flows through this plexus of small blood vessels and absorbs the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin. And once the blood has passed through the plexus, collecting the hormones, the blood passes into the posterior hypophyseal vein, and from there it drains into the main venous drainage systems in the body, so it can be distributed systemically. Now let's move on to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which is the adenohypophysis. And it's interesting to note that the activity of the anterior pituitary gland is also largely controlled by the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus regulates anterior pituitary function by producing a range of neurohormones which regulate the release of the trophic hormones that are actually produced by the adenohypophysis, by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And these neurohormones produced by the hypothalamus are often described as releasing hormones. So they are hormones in their own right, but they then control the release of the trophic hormones produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland itself. And it's fascinating to note how these releasing hormones are actually transported from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Now this could be done, I suppose, in the way that any endocrine hormone is released, in that the hypothalamus could release the releasing hormones. These could be distributed through the systemic blood supply, and from the systemic blood supply they would eventually get to the adenohypophysis to stimulate release of the trophic hormones. But if this was done, relatively large amounts of the releasing hormones would have to be produced because they would be dissolved in the totality of the blood volume. But what the hypothalamus does is it greatly increases its level of efficiency, and it can actually get away with producing very small volumes of these releasing hormones, because the releasing hormones are not systemically diluted in all of the blood volume, but they pass directly from the hypothalamus down into the anterior pituitary gland, and they do so via a portal system. And a portal system is a system which begins and ends in capillaries. So there is a primary plexus at the base of the hypothalamus at the top of the pituitary stalk. Now the releasing hormones themselves are actually produced in other neurosecretory neurons in the hypothalamus, and they are released near the primary plexus. These releasing hormones, produced by hypothalamic secretory neurons, will then diffuse into the primary plexus, and from the primary plexus they will go in veins directly just down the short distance of the pituitary stem, just down the short distance from the primary plexus at the base of the hypothalamus to the secondary plexus, where they're released actually in the anterior pituitary gland. So what this means is the releasing hormones can go from the hypothalamus through these portal veins to be released in the secondary plexus in the anterior pituitary gland, where they can then control the release of the trophic hormones produced by the glandular tissue of the adenohypophysis itself. So it's a very neat system. It's called a portal system. So what we've described here is the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. It's going from the hypothalamus through portal veins to the hypophysis, to the adenohypophysis. So I suppose technically it's the hypothalamo-adenohypophyseal system, but that's a bit of a mouthful. We'd normally call it the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. Now, one of these releasing hormones that travels from the hypothalamus through the portal system to the adenohypophysis is growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. And this growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates specialized cells in the adenohypophysis called somatotrophs. And the function of these somatotrophs is to produce growth hormone, which stimulates the process of growth, particularly during childhood and adolescence. But it's also interesting to note that the hypothalamus produces another substance called growth hormone release inhibiting hormone. Growth hormone release inhibiting hormone will reduce the amount of growth hormone released by the somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone releasing hormone will stimulate the somatotrophs to produce more growth hormone, whereas growth hormone releasing inhibiting hormone will reduce the amount of growth hormone secreted by the somatotrophs. Another hypothalamic releasing hormone is thyrotrophin releasing hormone. Again, this travels down the portal veins into the secondary plexus in the adenohypophysis, where it will increase the production of thyroid stimulating hormone by thyrotrophs. So thyrotrophin releasing hormone stimulates anterior pituitary thyrotrophs, another type of specialist cell in the anterior pituitary, the thyrotrophs, and the thyrotrophs produce thyroid stimulating hormone, which of course goes on to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more thyroid hormone. Another one of the releasing hormones produced in the hypothalamus is corticotrophin releasing hormone. And the corticotrophin releasing hormone again passes down the portal system to the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates a particular type of cell in the anterior pituitary called corticotrophs. And the corticotrophs produce ACTH, adrenocorticotrophic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal cortex. So that's corticotrophin releasing hormone stimulating corticotrophs to produce more ACTH, adrenocorticotrophic hormone. Now, gonadotrophin releasing hormone is also produced by the hypothalamus, and the gonadotrophin releasing hormone will stimulate cells in the anterior pituitary called gonadotrophs, and it's the function of the gonadotrophs to produce the luteinizing hormone, the LH, and the follicular stimulating hormone, the FSH. So that's gonadotrophin releasing hormone stimulating gonadotrophs to produce luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. Now, another hormone produced by the hypothalamus is vasoactive intestinal peptide, or VIP, VIP. And despite its name, it's actually produced by the hypothalamus. And what the vasoactive intestinal peptide will do is it will stimulate specialist cells in the anterior pituitary gland called lactotrophs. And it's the lactotrophs that produce prolactin. And prolactin acts on the breasts to initiate and sustain the synthesis of milk, a process which of course is called lactation. Lact means to do with milk. For example, lactose is the sugar found in milk. And there's another substance produced by the hypothalamus called prolactin release inhibiting hormone. And we actually now know that this is a dopamine. But prolactin releasing inhibiting hormone will reduce the amount of prolactin produced by the lactotrophs. So we see that there's 6 of these trophic hormones released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. There's thyroid stimulating hormone released by the thyrotrophs. There's adrenocorticotrophic hormone, ACTH, produced by the corticotrophs. there's follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, both produced by the gonadotrophs. The anterior pituitary gland is also secreting prolactin, produced by lactotrophs, and growth hormone, produced and secreted by the somatotrophs. So distributed throughout the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, there's these 5 different types of tissue composed of different cells producing the trophic hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland, which in turn regulate growth during childhood and control of the other principal organs of the endocrine system throughout life. So as we see, a fascinating amount of physiology going on within a very small but vital anatomical area.